described as an existentialist. Still, no one quite knew what it meant. Sartre's most accessible statement of his ideas is found in a lecture he gave at almost the same time he started the new magazine. It was October 28, 1945, at the Club Maintenant in Paris. Sartre later had misgivings about the way he'd put things in his lecture, but when it was published, it crystallized the popular meaning of existentialism. He spoke very directly.
Not only is man what he conceives himself to be, but he is also only what he wills himself to be after his thrust toward existence. Man is nothing else but what he makes of himself. Such is the first principle of existentialism.
Sartre tried to explain to his listeners that existentialism isn't some gloomy, pessimistic doctrine, even though it confronts the evil in human life and is boldly atheistic. Existentialism doesn't say that human beings are reasonable or good, that we can count on progress or anything like that. Nonetheless, Sartre insisted in his lecture that existentialism is a kind of humanism. It encourages a positive view of the possibilities for human life.
When all is said and done, what we are accused of, at bottom, is not our pessimism, but an optimistic toughness. If some critics take exception to our works of fiction, in which we write about people who are soft, weak, cowardly, and sometimes even downright bad, it's not because these people are soft, weak, cowardly, or bad. Because if we were to say, as Émile Zola did, that they are that way because of heredity, or the workings of environment, or because of biological or psychological determinism, our readers would be reassured. They would say, well, that's what we are like. No one can do anything about it. But when the existentialist writes about a coward, he says that this coward is responsible for his cowardice. He's not like that because he has a cowardly heart or lung or brain. He's not like that on account of his physiological makeup, but he's like that because he has made himself a coward by his acts.
According to Sartre, there's no such thing as a cowardly constitution.
There are nervous constitutions. There is poor blood, as the common people say, or strong constitutions. But the man whose blood is poor is not a coward on that account. For what makes cowardice is the act of renouncing or yielding. A constitution is not an act. The coward is defined on the basis of the acts he performs. When we say this, people feel, in a vague sort of way, that this coward we are talking about is guilty of being a coward, and the thought frightens them.
Existentialism thus seems to threaten and attract people at the same time. It criticizes the way we live by saying we cover up our freedom with all sorts of excuses, but it also takes the optimistic view that we can change. As Sartre put it,
there is always a possibility for the coward not to be cowardly anymore.
It's not hard to see how such a doctrine immediately found a response in post-war France. After the German occupation of France in World War II, every Frenchman in some way felt compromised. People needed to be able to feel both guilt and the possibility for renewal. This has been the appeal of existentialism ever since. Sartre continued his lecture by emphasizing that existentialism is not actually a popular ideology at all, much less a scandalous one.
It is the most austere of doctrines. It is intended strictly for specialists and philosophers, yet it can be defined easily. What all existentialists have in common is that they think that existence precedes essence.
But what on earth does that mean? In order to explain this formula that existence precedes essence, Sartre asked his listeners to consider some object that's manufactured, a book or a paper cutter. You might consider any natural object, too, like a flower or a horse. Each of these things is defined in terms of certain given traits and functions. In philosophical parlance, each of them has an essential nature, an essence. And what these things are, how they actually exist, is measured in relation to that given essence. In this way, an object's essence precedes and judges its existence. All we have to know in order to decide whether we have a good specimen of a paper cutter, or a flower, or a horse, is whether it properly fulfills its essence. Does the paper cutter cut? Does the plant grow and flower according to its species? Does the horse neigh and run? It's easy. Find out what the essential nature of something is, and you can judge it. But Sartre declares, with man, it's different. Man has no essential nature, no essence. There is no common human nature which tells us in advance what it is to be a man in the ethical sense. This is what it means to say that for human beings, existence precedes essence. Sartre continues his lecture.
It means that, first of all, man exists, turns up, appears on the scene, and only afterwards defines himself. If man, as the existentialist conceives him, is indefinable, it is because at first he is nothing. Only afterward will he be something, and he himself will have made what he will be. Man is at the start a plan which is aware of itself, rather than a patch of moss, a piece of garbage, or a cauliflower. Nothing exists prior to this plan. There is nothing in heaven. Man will be what he will have planned to be. Thus, existentialism's first move is to make every man aware of what he is and to make the full responsibility of his existence rest on him.
This is the thesis, then, that a human being chooses and makes himself, herself. Each man is responsible for what he becomes. But there's more. Sartre says each of us is also responsible for all men. What does this mean? Since your choices are yours alone, and since there's no way you can define what's good for anyone else, what could it possibly mean to say that each of us is responsible for all men?
When we say that man chooses his own self, we mean that every one of us does likewise. But we also mean by that in making this choice, he also chooses all men. In fact, in creating the man that we want to be, there is not a single one of our acts which does not at the same time create an image of man as we think he ought to be. I am creating a certain image of man of my own choosing. In choosing myself, I choose man.
This doesn't mean that you or I actually prescribe values for anyone else, or that we choose for them. We can't do that. But it does mean that our choices have an ultimate importance. Sartre says it's as if all mankind had its eyes fixed on me and were guiding themselves by what I do. The point here is that you or I can't just act with nothing more attaching to it. I can't just do as I please without creating vast consequences. In doing what pleases me, for example, I'm inevitably saying, this is the sort of person I am. I'm saying that I value this sort of life, in this case, the life of someone who simply does as he pleases. And I'm responsible for it, whether I like it or not, as Sartre puts it.
At every moment, I am obliged to perform exemplary acts.
Each of us is creating human values. Our responsibility, therefore, is great. In doing whatever we do, each of us gives to human values, images, and ideals the only status they have in the world. We can't appeal to anything outside ourselves to support our choices. We're responsible, so we must agonize over our choices.
Man is anguish, we find no values or commands to turn to.